Good evening, everyone. Welcome to King's College, to the law school. My name is Otávio Ferraz. I'm a professor of human rights and public law here, and also the director of the Transnational Law Institute, which is co-organizing this event with Global Canopy. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. The title of our event is A New Roadmap for Brazil and for the Amazon. We have a great line of speakers who I will introduce afterwards, because we're going to watch a film to warm us up to the debate. But I have a couple of practical issues to talk about before we start. One is toilets. The female and gender-neutral toilets are down that way, so you go right and then left through the doors in front of the lifts, and it's on the right side there. The male toilets are not working on this floor, but there are some working on the second floor, so you have to go up the steps. If there is a fire alarm, which we hope there won't be, you just follow the clearly signposted emergency exits. The closest one is to the left, 2 flights of stairs down, and then outside to the Somerset House courtyard. There will be drinks after the event in the adjacent room, the Wellington room. And I think that's it for practical information. So before we go on to the discussion, we are showing an excerpt of a film called Eu Sou Uma Arara. I am a Macau. By the Brazilian filmmaker Mariana Lacerda and the visual artist Rivani Noyenchvanda. The documentary is still being finalized, but should be complete next month. It was filmed during the demonstrations that took place in São Paulo in October and November 2022, just before the presidential elections. It's described by the directors as a forest in action, a contribution to the restoration of democracy in Brazil, a way to take the social environmental agenda to the streets, drawing a line which should be inseparable between the maintenance of democracy and the establishment of nature as a subject of law. So the film is about 6 minutes long, after which we will start our debate. Thanks again for coming, and I hope you enjoy the event.
dominação dos humanos é indissociável do desejo de dominação das coisas. Não querer dominar as coisas, descobrir a humanidade das coisas, é o passo fundamental para nos livrar da dominação dos humanos. Por isto, emancipados eram os índios bororos que diziam: eu sou uma arara. Nunca foi tão evidente a incompatibilidade radical entre o capitalismo e a vida.
So let's start the discussion. I think it's a great way of putting us in the mood. And by the way, those who appreciate this kind of films, there is another one right next to us here on 180 the Strand Studios, Richard Moss. I don't know if you had the opportunity to go. It's finishing in April, and it's really good and also strong, a bit like this one, but a totally different model of filmmaking. So it's a great pleasure for me to have Adriana Ramos here with us today. Thank you so much for coming to King's. She is a journalist and a public policy specialist at Instituto Socioambiental, the ISA, a Brazilian NGO that works for the protection of social, collective, and public goods and rights regarding the environment, cultural heritage, human rights, and people's rights. So a lot to do with what we do here at the Transnational Law Institute as well. She works on the design and improvement of social and environmental legislation and policies related to the indigenous people's rights, tropical forests, and other ecosystems in Brazil. She's also one of the members of the Amazon Fund Guidance Committee and part of the coordination of the Climate Change Observatory, which is a coalition of civil society organizations in Brazil working collectively on responses to the climate emergency. She has actually been in Europe and in the UK since last week, and spent International Forest Day, which was just 2 days ago, speaking to MPs in the UK Parliament. I would also like to invite Joana Setzer, who is a Brazilian lawyer who has been living in the UK for over 15 years. She's an assistant professor at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at our rivals just across the road, the London School of Economics. And Cristiane Fontes, who is a Brazilian journalist who has been living in Oxford for 4 years now and leading the Brazil and Regional Partnership Program at Global Canopy, who is our co-sponsor in this event together with the LSE Grantham Institute. She's also behind a special project at the Brazilian newspaper Folha de São Paulo, Entranced Planet, Planeta em Transe. I recommend that everyone looks at the articles that they publish there, which are really interesting and important. And they interview emerging voices on the climate action and climate emergency agendas. And last but not least, Helen Belfield, who is Global Canopy's Policy Director and the Deputy Director of TRACE, a partnership initiative between Global Canopy and the Stockholm Environment Institute, bringing transparency to the supply chains and finance around forest risk commodities. Like Adriana, in the last month, she has also been giving evidence to MPs about the role of due diligence legislation in the EU and the UK and the importance of extending it to financial institutions. So without further ado, I will ask Cristiane to start like the debate. I think we can use these mics.
Okay, hello. Welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be here with all of you and to be discussing a new roadmap for Brazil and for the Amazon. I would like to start with a few and brief thank you. First of all, to the King's team, Alison in particular, and also Otávio for hosting us here. Also a big thank you for all Global Canopus team and for those of Global Canopus team who are here, Laura, Sam, and also Helen Belfield, who is replacing Nick Mothers. And also another big thank you to Adriana Ramos, who should be on holiday and spending part of her holiday working with us here and explaining what's going on in Brazil. And also another muito obrigada to Joana Setzer, who is going to be co-moderating this panel with me. And last but not least, I can see her here, a big muito obrigada to Grace Souza, who was the person responsible for all of this to happen here today, and for connecting me with Otávio. So let's start this conversation, Adriana. I'd like to start asking you, as you know, there's loads of excitement about Brazil being back to the climate action scene, with Lula's announcement of his commitment with zero deforestation, and with an announcement last year now becoming something real, the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs. So a set of questions to start with for you. What has happened in Brazil since the beginning of the year regarding the climate, nature, and people's agenda? Also, what are your own expectations about this new government? And how do you think is or should be the priorities of civil society to move us forward?
Wow.
It's a big factor.
Thank you, Krika. Thanks, Otávio and Joana, for being here, for you all to be here also. Well, I think that we have really huge expectations and a lot of relief on Lula's victory after everything we have passed through. And for sure, the creation of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples is one very good news. The structure of the ministry is still in process of being organized, but we can see that there is a lot of good energy and good people coming to join Sonia in this plan. And the presence of Sonia within a government that we know that it's also a multi-party government with several different sectors taking part will surely be something important in order to put the indigenous rights agenda in track again in Brazil. I think that the fact that Marina Silva was appointed as a Ministry of Environment is also very important, and especially the first measure that was taken by her, which was to establish a plan to combat deforestation, not only in the Amazon, but for all biomes. This is also something very huge. And it follows the announcements that Lula have done in COP, committing himself with zero deforestation up to 2030, and without taking into account the difference between legal and illegal deforestation, which was also very good news. The fact that the Amazon Fund was also one of the first measures that were taken so that the fund can be available as soon as possible to support the necessities both of the government and from civil society to deal with this agenda was also very important. It's interesting to highlight that there was this amendment of the Constitution that was done and approved by the Congress even before Lula assumed, to change the fiscal legislation that established a limitation to the use of the public budget by the government. And that limitation also applied to international resources. So the fact that this has changed will allow the Amazon Fund to be an important source of funding for all the political agenda on combating deforestation. And that was something really important because the government's almost broken. There wouldn't be a budget to work on that in the first year. So the Amazon Fund is going to fulfill this gap. And there was already a meeting of the committee that have established that besides the criteria and priorities that were already set, this emergency within the Yanomami and all the agenda of fiscalization, monitoring, and control will be supported by the fund. And I think that for us in civil society, besides the expectation, there is a lot of work to be done, not only because the context in the Congress keeps the same, so we still have a lot of bills of law that puts risk to this agenda. So we still have to advocate and to pressure and to work in advocacy work to guarantee that these proposals are not approved in a Congress that we know that the government does not have the majority, but also because there will be necessity of a lot of cooperation with the government, So we are already being invited to take part in many meetings and seminars and a lot of initiatives to build a strong agenda of participation of civil society. So good news, at least at the moment, good expectations and a lot of work.
Otávio, would you like to complement Adriana's response?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that Adriana has said. The expectations and belief, like with which you started, was something that everyone worried, concerned about the environment, but also human rights and other progressive issues have felt. I was back in Brazil just before the elections, and I was there during the long night when the votes were counted, and the result came out like very tightly in favor of Lula. But I think at one point I wanted to add is that as well the resources issue that you mentioned already, and it's really important to know that the Amazon Fund will be able to be used to help, like add funds to the government's ones to tackle the hundreds of different issues that are there to be tackled. The Yanomami emergency is really in the news now and in everyone's minds, but there are many different and equally bad situations that need to be addressed. So resources will be an issue, and the expectations that she mentioned are so high that they'll have to be managed now. And there is already frustration. I have a couple of projects in the Amazon. I might talk more about that later, but in one of them, in the Rio Negro, it's a reserve that has been created in 2018. The last one created in Brazil before Bolsonaro took over and promised never not to create any more centimeter of units of conservation, and fulfilled his promise. And so they were really like happy with the results of the elections. But I've just received that a WhatsApp this morning from one of the main people there saying the people who are causing the harm are still to be perturbed. Ainda estão por ser perturbados, which means government hasn't arrived there yet. It is in the Yanomami very strongly. It's saying now that it will go to other areas, but do we have enough resources and political will to get to all the areas which need attention? And how do you do that at the same time? It's a bit like that story of the short blanket. When you pull it from your feet, like to cover your feet, you uncover another part of your body, and it's still. So I think that will be a great challenge for the new government.
Anything from you, Joanna?
Yeah, I think I want to pick exactly where Otávio left, which is and we're going to speak about data, but if you look at data, deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon in February was the highest level on record for the month. So the challenge is still there. As we were saying, the highest expectation doesn't immediately translate into action. And so there's need for policing, for enforcement, law enforcement, really. And the point I want to make also is that talking about law enforcement, there is a need to rebuild and undo the harm that was done to legislation as well. So there's this really interesting study by Instituto NOAA, and I was shocked with the number. There were 140,000 acts from
both executive and legislative, that dealt with the environmental and climate policy during the Bolsonaro administration. Out of these, there were 2,100 something that are really relevant, and they identified 400 acts that need urgent undoing. So you need to revoke or change or amend 400 pieces of legislation and acts of the executive. So there's a lot of of work to do on the law enforcement side, on undoing and creating and amending legislation. And I think one aspect from the institutional level that is quite interesting to see is how climate and environment is cutting across several ministries. So it's not just the environmental and the climate secretariat and the indigenous one, but also I read in an article recently published that 19 of the 37 ministries have that component in their agenda, and I think that's really a very good start. So
that's unique, actually, yes, Joanna.
Yes.
Okay.
So then I think, on the data, we're going to speak more, continue talking to that, but I guess we have a round of questions before that, right?
No, I think it's
Can I
with you. Yeah, please go ahead.
Into that? Okay, so you see, we're very here coordinated, and we go from data into asking Helen a question about the work that they do at Global Canopy, which it's a really important part of this question, which is we have enough technology and systems in place to monitor what's happening. And Brazil in particular has a really strong system for monitoring deforestation, financial data. And this is what I want to ask you. In your work at Global Canopy, what do you see? What is the data telling us about the role of corporations and finance in driving and stopping deforestation in Brazil?
Great. So can you hear me okay? So that's a big question. I'm going to take a bit of a lens from looking at agricultural commodities. So a recent paper from some colleagues at Trace and Chalmers University looked at sort of untangling the numbers around tropical deforestation, because there's quite a lot of numbers thrown around and often a lot of different assumptions in these data sets. But 99% of deforestation is in landscapes dominated by agriculture. 2/3 of that is linked to agricultural expansion. And obviously a lot of that is linked to a handful of commodities, so beef, soy, palm oil. Looking at Brazil, cattle pasture expansion is the largest driver by far of tropical deforestation in Brazil. And it's actually around 1/5 of all tropical deforestation is the Brazilian cattle sector. So it's a huge challenge. I think importantly, when thinking about companies in the finance sector, 80% of cattle stays in Brazil, is consumed by the domestic market. We often, particularly in Europe, we forget about the importance of domestic markets. And about 20% of that is exported, also with leather. So the role of companies and financial institutions at the simple level is that they are facilitating the production, the trade, and then the consumption of these commodities down supply chains. And the finance sector, whether it's banks, whether it's investors in public companies, are providing the finance to these companies. The second largest driver is soy, particularly actually in the Cerrado, but also increasingly in the Pampa. We've seen a huge explosion in conversion of native vegetation in the Pampa, which I think is quite concerning. So great to hear Lulu's commitment to all biomes, because I think the Amazon is critical, but it's also really important that we don't see leakage into the Cerrado and Pampa as well. Most of soy is exported, along with maize, which is often forgotten. It's a sort of forgotten crop, which is often intercrop with soy. It's a critical part of the economy. A lot of that goes mainly to China, along with that fraction of beef, which is exported. Although a good chunk comes to Europe as well, the majority of that is in animal feed. So feeding all the pork and poultry in Europe and China. So I think that's where, companies and financial institutions have a role. We've seen a lot of them, well, some of them make voluntary deforestation commitments, although the recent Forest 500 report, which Global Canopy did in February, looking at the most influential sort of 350 companies and 150 financial institutions, show that 40% have made absolutely no commitment whatsoever. And I think the effectiveness of voluntary commitments has also been questioned quite a lot. We've seen in Brazil that despite voluntary commitments and despite market signals, in the absence of strong government and the absence of strong enforcement and laws, we've seen deforestation rapidly increase and a lot of the gains being lost, which is also a silver lining with the new government, that command and control does work. But I think it shows that markets can provide an important signal, but without producer government capacity and support, there's a limit to what they can achieve. And I think I'll leave it there for further discussion.
Super. Adriana, would you like to complement Helen's response?
Yeah, well, I think that, as Joanna said, we have these numbers of deforestation still high, and I think that we will still have at least 1 year of high levels of deforestation. It won't be something quick. In fact, because the first 6 months are still the accountability of the year of Bolsonaro, but even afterwards, because as Otávio said, the stakeholders and the crime is still in there, you know, and the majority of deforestation in Brazil is still illegal. So even the private commitments do not, have specific results in the deforestation rates in general, you know. So I think that there is this necessity, this is something that the government feels a lot, the necessity of showing the size of the dismantling that was made and what is the baseline that they are starting to work with, because it's less than it was when Bolsonaro got, you know. So there is this, the transition government used this study of Talanoa, for example, to set the measures that must be changed in the next months. And I think that there will be a huge process for reviewing the legislation at the same time that they also update the understanding about the drivers of deforestation, what they started to do with a technical seminar that was taken a few weeks ago, in which they are already seeing some changes, including in the dynamics. And we were talking about the change, for example, in meat exportation that are increasing and the internal consumption reducing a bit. But I think that one thing that I didn't mention in the beginning, and it's interesting talking about the control of this deforestation, is this enforcement of the rural environmental register that the plan against deforestation is announcing to do, and that the government has already canceled 4 million hectares of illegal register that was done overlapping with indigenous territories, just by bringing the layer of indigenous territories for the system, which the Bolsonaro government have taken out. So I think that there is still a lot to be done in terms of updating the governmental systems and framework so that they are able to start implement policies that will in the future have results. So I think that this feeling of expectations and failures will be with us, yes, for a while.
Sorry, Adriana, it's still you on the spotlight.
Yes.
So you have been traveling around Europe for almost 2 weeks now, and I'd like to hear from you. What are the most common questions you have been hearing from people, in addition to the ones that we have already discussed? And how best do you think the international community could help Brazil with at the current moment?
Yeah. Well, I think that there is a huge doubt on whether Lula will be able to pass through the resistance they have in Congress, and especially with the rural caucus. So all this agenda that still relies a lot in the decisions that have to be taken by the Congress. So this is a huge doubt. There are also, I've been participating in discussions about the EU-Mercosur agreement, and there are many doubts on how far we are going with this, if the Lula's government is really willing to advance with the agreement, and if the agreement will, combine with this agenda, because there are expectations that go, I think, beyond the capacity of the government to I'd say to set the basis for this agreement to work at the ground at this moment. So a lot of expectations on how to guarantee that smallholders are attended in this as I'll say in this agenda, because the whole agreement and even the regulations against deforestation are more settled to attend the demands of the big landowners, those that are already exporting. And so there is this huge expectation on how far he's going to be, he will manage to implement this agenda, you know. What we have been discussing, especially considering this regulation, is that at this moment, looking at the scenario of the private sector, what they have done or they haven't done for so many times with commitments that they haven't made the difference in the ground sometimes. And at the same time, with this huge agenda that the government have set, is that the international cooperation, at least the public international cooperation at this moment, should focus in the policies that the government is promoting, you know, because if we guarantee that the partnership that the EU regulation is bringing, or the cooperation that can raise from the regulation here, that would fit very well to support some of the agendas of the plan against deforestation in a broad way. So it would democratize the opportunities in a sense that could support all landowners and smallholders to adequate themselves. So besides the implementation of the CAR, also this shift in the standard of the public financing, because there is this announcement that was done that the public finance for the agriculture sector will be will come from the Plano Safra, which is the public finance that doesn't have any kind of environmental criteria, to the low carbon agriculture program, you know. So I think that this change, for example, can bring much more smallholders to the compliance and to be able to access new markets here. So I think that this should be the focus at this moment. And I think that that will be the dispute, because we also see that the private sector in Brazil is completely against the regulation, although they support the agreement, because they don't want the regulation to be implemented. And they are seeking that if it's going to be implemented, the partnership and the cooperation should be done with them. You know, so I think that from our side, at this moment, our understanding is that this is the most important moment to strengthen the political will that Lula has shown, you know, and support the public policies that the government's put in place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. I want to continue following up on this question about the EU regulation. And if I may, I also want to just let you know that today we published a new report, the Grantham Research Institute, and I'm one of the authors, where we did, together with two colleagues, a really difficult job of mapping all the new EU legislation. So the report's called Climate Change Law in Europe, What the New EU Climate Laws Mean for the Courts. So we look at all this new Fit for 55 package and what it could mean in terms of new litigation and how the litigation has influenced some of this legislation. So as it was published today, I'm taking also the opportunity to mention this. And part of the report looks exactly at what I want to ask you, which is the deforestation-free commodities regulation. So it's been something that has been very much discussed, created a lot of controversy. And I wanted to hear your views on the EU regulation on deforestation-free commodities and how this topic has been discussed in Brazil.
Well, in fact, it has been very few discussions about that, you know. Even within civil society, it was really restricted to the organizations that are more working with Europe outside of Brazil. There was a huge mobilization when it was to be approved on the discussion of inclusion of Cerrado. And I think that that was the topic that was more popular within civil society in Brazil. But I don't think that not even from the private sector or the government, there were the interest of opening a huge discussion about that, you know. So we followed because we were with attention on that. And there was this discussion about including the Cerrado. As I heard from the ambassador of Brazil in the Brussels mission, they are not quite happy with that. You know, they think it was completely unilateral, that it's like an imposition, and that Brazil would need a lot of support, including transfer of technology, which got me a little bit scared about him saying that, because I asked him afterwards, what kind of technology do you think we still need on that? No, because I think that in terms of monitoring, traceability and everything, we have enough technology to deal with.
And to share with.
And to share, yes, to transfer technology to others. That was what we were doing with the monitoring initiative of INPE. So I think that once more, it was something that the major stakeholders, the private sector, you know, took from the agenda as if it was something that they could avoid, you know, and didn't let the discussion get a broad constituency in Brazil.
That's fascinating, because we heard from Helen that 99% of deforestation is connected to agriculture, right? And what this new EU regulation does, it prohibits any import of products that are connected to deforestation. So I would imagine that the Brazilian market would be very much interested in discussing this. So Helen.
Yes, I've been quite closely following this, working with Trace. I agree. I think there's been very little communication by the Commission with producer countries at all, and what has been with government, not with civil society or wider private sector. There was a recent presentation by the Commission last week for one of the first times, but I think it's very poorly understood and poorly communicated what the requirements are and what the expectations are. So I think it hasn't been well understood or well communicated, the requirements for individual traceability back to the polygon all the way through the supply chain, and what that means in terms of existing traceability systems and the need for investment and adaptation, but also, you know, even the use of FAO definition of forests, that doesn't align with the existing Brazil monitoring system, which is incredible. So, you know, what does that mean for PRODES going forward? You know, are we going to see duplication? And I think there's been a big missed opportunity for the EU to engage and build on existing systems in producer countries, to strengthen those, to help invest where needed. And I think that's a big risk going forward, that we'll end up with a bifurcated market where the large producers who have been producing on land cleared before 2020 in the south of Brazil are able to service the EU market, and those others are cut out, or we'll see shifts in market and no transformation on the ground whatsoever. So clean EU supply chains, but no change outside of that, which I think is a big risk, particularly also with the exclusion of smallholders. So yeah, I think that's a big challenge, and I think over the next 18 months, we're going to see much more need for communication and also incentives. So the EU, as part of this package, has said that there will be incentives and partnerships, but there's very little information on what those partnerships look like. We know that, you know, some of the big needs from Brazil right now are resources, incentives, you know, how to use already degraded land, how to secure land tenure, you know, how to support indigenous peoples who we've seen the best guardians of forests, and that's totally missing at the moment. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed.
Sorry, yes, I don't know if you're going to comment what I was going to ask you to comment. What you have been speaking about the monitoring and tracking systems and previous investments on that, and how.
Yeah, no, we just began by saying that what's interesting is that the agribusiness sector in Brazil does not recognize they are the drivers of deforestation at all. You know, there are many meetings in which we start to talk about that, and then they bring the logging companies, you know, and at the last time I was in a discussion like that, the representative of a project that works with the private sector highlighted that there are many people in Brazil still cooking using timber, you know, a source of energy, such as if that was the huge problem of
No, they are
deforestation.
the
So,
solution.
yeah.
You're so outdated. They are the solution.
yes, they are the solutions. They are not part of the problem. So that's why they just, they avoid the discussion at all. So I think this is one thing. Yeah, I think that this is something that really caught me when the ambassador said, because I think that if there is some things that we already had in Brazil, a lot of experience is, and also with partners abroad, is monitoring and traceability. And if this is not working, it's because people don't want it to work, you know. So I think that it's quite important that we get this opportunity, and that's why we are trying to connect this partnership with the public policies, you know. It's to put in place, and I think that it will be key, for example, to organize a seminar on traceability methodologies in Brussels, you know, so that we can show the Brazilian ambassador and others, you know, that there is plenty of methodologies and possibilities to be used in a sense, and that the public policies that are being raised in Brazil now connect these possibilities. And if we support this as a public policy, we will also give the opportunity to more people to achieve, you know, the possibilities of new markets, although we still have doubts on how far this will really increase markets for Brazil, you know, because this is also a challenge. What we have seen is that we have changed the government from a climate denier to a committed government, but the private sector didn't find out that happened in Brazil yet. Not even the ambassador.
Can we move from
Yeah,
the
yes.
the EU to the UK?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
okay. So the next question brings us to the UK, and I want to ask Helen, actually, if you can tell us a bit more about what is going on here in terms of UK legislation and your views on the UK government's plans.
I will try. So yeah, the UK has apparently world-leading legislation on forest as commodity due diligence,
Apparently,
which was world-leading when they announced it before COP, but they've not done much in the next 18 months, and they've been overtaken by the EU. But no, so the UK has similar due diligence legislation for forest-based commodities. The main difference is that it's focused on legality, not on legal deforestation, where the EU goes beyond that. There's very little detail. So it's passed, it's in law and legislation, but we're waiting with bated breath for the secondary legislation, which will set out which commodities it covers, and also what the reporting requirements will be, unlike the EU law, which sets out very clearly the traceability requirements needed. That's not in the primary legislation of the UK, so it's a bit wait and see. So we're hopeful that it will be strong and ambitious, but I think we'll have to find out. I think the likelihood is it will cover a smaller set of commodities, but it may cover more derivatives, which is also quite important, particularly thinking about going beyond just raw, like leather hides, into more manufactured products. That could be a significant step beyond what the EU is doing. It also doesn't include finance, similar to the EU, but there has been recently, there's a Financial Services and Markets Bill that's going through the Commons at the moment, and there has been some cross-party support to include an amendment that would include financial due diligence. I think it's very unlikely to make it into law, but it's a positive start that it has got cross-party support, both in the Commons but also in the Lords, and it may lead to a concession by the government to take more action on this topic, even if it doesn't make it into law.
But what's the timeline, Helen?
For the
Any idea of the timeline?
For the secondary legislation,
Yes.
we've been waiting 18 months and counting. So I'd expect, hopefully, in the next few months we'll see something. But yeah, we've been waiting for that. So who knows?
Adriana, how does this sound to you? This difference between legal and illegal deforestation?
Well, I think that not me, nor the climate or the atmosphere makes no difference for that. And I'm glad that I didn't see Lula doing this difference also. So I think that we are a step forward on that, because in the case of Brazil, we are talking about more than 90% of illegal deforestation at all. So I really think that this is something that we should just turn the page, and there is a set of bills of law in the Brazilian Congress that can shift what is illegal to legal in a very quick way, So there is the bill of law for licensing of infrastructure projects, the land grabbing bill of law, the proposals that open indigenous territories for mining and other activities. So I think that this doesn't make any sense if we are talking about compliance and climate. We have to talk about deforestation, because unless we will just pressure the Brazilian Congress to go further in terms of changing and giving more amnesty all the time, and that will make no difference at all in the general approach.
I think Helen would like to.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think both the EU and the UK are also quite weak on human rights, because it's based on legality, and obviously what we've seen over the last 4 years of Bolsonaro has shown how easy that is to erode those rights and to lead to what we've seen. So I think that's something also that civil society has tried to push, to see that go beyond produce legislation and really look to codify international human rights outside of that. But that hasn't been a battle we've won so far, but it's something that I think is also a missing piece.
Quick comment
yeah,
on the
please.
distinction, legal and illegal deforestation. One way of solving this is to make all deforestation illegal, right? Then do we need to deforestate more? Especially in Brazil?
I think also there's an open question both on the UK and the EU law of actually legality compliance could be much more far-reaching than is understood currently, because it could lead to not just compliance with the forest code in the Amazon and Sahara, but also in the south of Brazil. Has riparian areas been restored? Does everyone have the right licenses? So I think there is still a bit of an open question that actually compliance with legality could actually be much more challenging than compliance with deforestation free as well. So something to watch there, I think, as well.
Good. So we've covered quite a lot of grounds in this part about agriculture connected deforestation, and now getting towards the end, I want to move to Otávio and ask you about this recent article you published and your views on illegal mining. So what do you think are the actions that are still needed and that maybe the new government will be taking to tackle illegal mining?
Yeah, after we hear that 90% is due to agriculture, like illegal mining seems like a tiny problem compared, but from what we saw happening in the Yanomami region and also in many others in Brazil, you see that the human suffering is perhaps of a similar magnitude. I've just been to this place in Pará, the Munduruku region, which is the next in line. So the Yanomami got all the attention and resources of the government, which is good because they were in a situation which was an emergency. So declaring a public health emergency there was the only appropriate thing to do, no doubt about that. But there are many others who are waiting in the line now, in the queue, including the Munduruku, the Kayapó, where mining is even larger than the Yanomami. So that will be a big challenge. And I make a distinction to try and understand like the magnitude of the challenge between repression, which is what happened in the first phase in the Yanomami. So to go in there and stop the illegal activities through police force, through the army if needed. So repression, which is needed, but also changing the incentives framework that are in place to make this happen in the first place. And if you don't change those, no amount of repression will solve the problem, because once you turn to another place, they come back because the incentives are too high. And that goes not only for illegal mining, for gold, which is obviously a very lucrative business, but for all the other drivers of deforestation, cattle, soy, wood. So we have to try and find a solution in the incentives that are still there for people to invade land and take the wood, put cattle there, plant soy, and dig for gold, like these four main drivers of deforestation. And then it's here that I think that some of the discussion that they were having here about the EU due diligence directive, how to regulate companies as well, is important, not sufficient, but important. I think there is a big element in us all consumers. Why do we still buy gold? Why do we still eat meat as much as we do, you know, like, or want like this beautiful piece of wood, like to furnish our houses? I think that a change of mentality would be important. As Helen said, 80% of the meat goes to the domestic market. So even if you change the habits here, I think the UK is now one of the countries that eat least meat in the world. There are more vegans and vegetarians, but there's no shortage of other people elsewhere, including Brazil, that do it. So we have to change with people like wanting a picanha, like a cap of the rump, which is the favorite piece of steak in Brazil for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like every day. As I used to do, so I'm not like excluding myself. When I lived in Brazil, it's hard to avoid meat, right? The smell is everywhere and it's great. So how do you change that? It's not, we won't find a solution. But on the regulation of companies, I wanted to say a couple of words that come from my research there. Brazil has a very strong, so in law enforcement as well, a very strong institution called the Ministério Público, the Public Prosecutor's Office, which, unlike in most countries, is not just pursuing criminals and starting criminal lawsuits, but they also have a huge remit to protect indigenous people's rights, human rights, and the environment. So I think it's one of the few countries in the world where you have an institution that can go there and file lawsuits to protect the environment. And I interviewed public prosecutors in Pará, and they've been like filing lots of lawsuits trying to deal with the gold and the soya problem, which are the two biggest ones in the region. I went to the Tapajós River. And one of the things they are trying to do, and I think that would be a very important improvement and development, would be to impose liability on the companies that are making profits from this at a later stage of the chain. Because with the garimpeiros, the illegal miners, like it unfortunately is repression. I think we also need to offer them opportunities to earn money elsewhere, but you have to go there and take them out of the land. Like there is no other thing to do. But these are not the guys who are making most of the money, like with the activity there. So to use legal mining only, because we don't have a lot of time, there are two big constituencies that have to be brought into the liability scheme, into like having legal liability to what they are doing through due diligence, which are the buyers of the gold. They are in Canada, Switzerland, here in the UK. Most of the illegal gold ends up here. And also the companies who provide the equipment for people to go and do the deforestation and illegal mining. These are huge machines now. And that's what changed the game. 20 years ago, when these machines weren't so readily, easily available, deforestation went at a slower pace. Now, with these big excavators and tractors and chains, they can clear an area of 50 hectares, in hours. And these are all multinational companies, Caterpillar, Hyundai, and a few others, who have monitoring technology, to go back to your point, to know where their machines are being used. So why not impose liability on these companies? So if they know that their machines is inside an indigenous people's territory, they have to shut it. And it's all remotely, you can do it with technology as well. They have the technology already, because these machines are so expensive. They cost about £1 million. that they are bought like in installments, and they have the monitoring technology, because if people stop paying, they can do that. So they do it if they stop paying, but they don't do it if they keep like digging gold from illegal land. So the technology is there, is the political will, like to use that like magical expression that it's in short supply, not only in Brazil, but here as well. But if the political will is not there, we have to find ways to try and dismount like the incentive framework everywhere we can, including ourselves. You mentioned Sumauma, like the article I wrote. Eliane Brum has this really strong piece about gold and why are we still using gold, based on that infamous episode of Brazilian football players after a match in the World Cup they won, going to a steakhouse and eating steak with gold powder on it. So what's the point of putting gold powder in a steak, you know? Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
You know, the store that have most sold Hyundai excavators in 2019 was in Itaituba. Yes.
600.
Yeah.
600 excavators in sorry, I need to work. Sorry there. So this Itaituba is a town that 20 or 30 years ago, like had like a few thousand people, and now has grown like it's a scar in the middle of the Amazon forest by the Tapajós River. The mayor of the town is a gold miner, is a garimpeiro who has been implicated in lots of illegal mining, and they sold 600 machines like that in the last few years, and there is no construction in the town, if you visit it, to justify it. And the town is surrounded by conservation units, be it indigenous people's lands or reserves. So the gold must be coming from illegal places, right? So it doesn't take a genius to see that, but the mayor of the town is part of the problem. I was going to say local politicians. So it's not only the Congress, which is very conservative, and there are lots of representatives of the deforestation beneficiaries, but also the local towns. Itaituba is controlled by illegal miners, like in the local region. But with political at the federal level, I think that can be dissolved. Right.
Adriana, would you like to comment on illegal mining and all that?
Well, no, but I
Other
think that I
strategies?
agree with what Otávio have said, and we're seeing that there are a lot of politicians that are completely engaged. They were very powerful in the recent years, and they tried a lot to change the legislation to guarantee the support, the legal support for this gold mining activity. And of course, because Bolsonaro was signing with the perspective of legalizing it, it has increased the investments inside indigenous territories. You know, I think that the government, we were expecting, for example, that the whole strategy of taking the invaders out of the Yanomami territory would be designed to guarantee, for example, that we're not leaked to the other regions. But in fact, I think that the government was willing to put light into the problem from the beginning. So that's why they went there so quickly, and they started the operations even without they having all the scheme prepared to what to do with the gold miners that would have to leave that territory. So this is still a lack of policy that is there. So the government will provide social programs to support the gold miners that they are taking out of the area, but they will still have to build, how to say, a complete strategy to deal with that, because they're looking at the Yanomami, but as you said, there are other areas in which we have. So I think that this will still be a problem for a while. It's not going to be solved that easy, you know. But just to mention another thing, the picanha was a very important piece of the campaign in Lula, no? Lula have announced that he will allow all Brazilians to eat picanha each weekend. So this is a great challenge for us all.
Yeah. You said that again.
He has said that before, and he's saying that it's
Yes.
almost there, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the important, and you mentioned it briefly, I think not all that agriculture sort of connected deforestation actually becomes productive agriculture. Sort of about half, 2/3, which just shows the role of land speculation, wildfires, issues of land tenure as well. So I think governance is critical even in that space.
Questions from online
Yes,
audience?
I was wondering if we want to open for questions.
No,
from
but
the
are you
floor.
going to get some questions from the online audience first and
I
then we
haven't
go?
received-
No, no questions? Okay, so questions from you guys? For them? Yes, please. Yeah. You?
The laptop,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
monitor the question.
I have a very naive question from the microphone.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I have a very naive question. So you've presented all the different problems. Bye. Presented all the different problems that it's also a bit shocking also to hear all the details. But what can we do in addition to attending, seminars like this and sending emails to politicians that we voted for, or not voted for? I mean, concretely, what can we do to participate in a more, meaningful manner?
I wish I could have better answers than what I have. I think that, well, Otávio mentioned few things related to consumption in terms of gold and meat. So I think that that is, of course, a very individual, important approach. I think that another thing that became clear in the video that we watched in the beginning is that we are still dealing with a lot of indifference. There is still a lot of indifference and lack of knowledge of the majority of people about the real problems that are going on. So I think that helping to strengthen that, and coming from this 4 year of Bolsonaro government, I wouldn't say that sending emails and engaging in advocacy campaigns in the internet is a small thing to do. It's been very important, as much as we manage to engage audience, because nowadays we know a few years ago when I started to work in Congress, it made the difference if I was going there to talk to the deputy, or if I would take 3 or 4 people with me to talk with the parliamentary. But nowadays, what makes difference is that they receive dozens of messages, and that we can really scale our message in the internet through their channels. So keep on doing that also.
Helen, please,
Maybe
yes.
just to add, so yeah, same for the European legislation. It had the biggest ever response to a consultation for an environmental law. And a lot of that was the power of the internet and people mobilizing. I'd also say ring your pension fund, ring your bank, bring companies up, like soy and beef, have at much lower levels of voluntary commitments than palm oil. And it's because orangutans are very cuddly, and Nestle get rung 4 times a week by people asking what they're doing about orangutans. So really important to ask companies to extend their policies to also include soy and beef, to ask your pension fund, what are they doing about deforestation? These guys respond to consumers. That's what concerns them. So I would really advocate for people to do that.
Yeah, just before we continue, I wanted to remind the audience in the Zoom that there is a Q&A function there for you to send your questions. We have a couple of questions already that we will ask after.
Yes, over there.
Thank you. Hi, Mayara from Plataforma Cipó Brazil. It's been mentioned that the issue of incentives in partnerships is still very unclear in terms of creating incentives to the enforcement of the new EU legislation. Adriana mentioned that technological transfer is not the issue. We have the technology, but you said maybe we should focus on cooperation around national policies. I wonder if you could expand a little bit what areas you see which are key, what sort of projects should we be telling the EU you should focus on this and support this?
Can we also get that one? Yes.
Hi, I'm Julia, PhD researcher at the University of Sussex. So my question is about the financial sector. So I think lots of those companies that are still causing deforestation. They are financed by the financial sector. And what would, I think, Adriana or anyone else in the panel think that would be like concrete actions that either the public or the government could take to change the strategy of the financial sector to make them stop financing companies that is connected to illegal deforestation or legal deforestation actions?
Adriana, you start.
Yeah, I can start, but I can't count on you both. You all to continue. Well, thinking about the policies in Brazil that could benefit from this partnership, I think that mainly the public financing system for agriculture. So the shift between the Plano Safra to the low carbon agriculture plan, I think that the government will need support to improve this, and the partnership could do that, and also the implementation of the CAR. And the implementation of the CAR together with other technologies that we already have are already opening opportunities for different approach, such as one that happened, and it was a surprise for us, that the BNDES in Brazil have used the MAP biomas base to cancel and to restrict financing to areas where we have deforestation. This was not even announced before, so it was quite a surprise, but showed that the financial system, if they want, they have information available to do this kind of choices, you know. So I remember, and I'm saying here, Anahita, that we have been together in some discussions with the private sector for a long time. I have been very concerned that all the discussions about the private sector were based in the statement that they said, well, we are committed, we just don't know how to do. You know, normally they use this as, I used to say, yes, it's like a comfort zone, you know, no, I really want to do, I just don't know how. What I think it got the time that they cannot say that anymore, you know, because now the tools are there and the possibilities of how to do that are really clear. So it's time to put that into practice. And it's interesting that we have a government in Brazil that are bringing these tools to the public policy, because then it shows not only we know how to do, but we want to do for everybody, not only for those that could pay for this, you know. So I think that that's the real difference that we will see if the government is successful in doing what they are announcing, you know.
There is another question from platform, Sipo, about.
No, yeah, it was about
Yeah,
the
yeah,
ABC
yes,
and the
okay,
car.
okay,
Yes, it
okay.
was that would be very.
Yeah, I think on the finance sector, I mean, the Forest 500 report saw that 2/3 of the ones who are giving the most financing to these companies have no policy at all. The majority don't see it as a business risk at all. Some of them see it as a reputational risk, but I think it's not a material issue, and the only way that's going to change is legislation. So I really think due diligence legislation that puts the onus on financial institutions to undertake proper due diligence, and penalties if they fail to comply is the only way. I'm sure Anahita as well has seen many of these financial institutions which have policies are still financing the same companies that have repeatedly seen to cause illegal deforestation, and are repeatedly financing them even though they have these commitments in place. So that's my view, is that it won't change without legislation. But I think to get there, consumers raising their issue with their banks, with their pension funds, can only help. But yeah, I think it's not going to be a material issue until legislation comes in.
Can I complement this just from a legal perspective? Like, this is why due diligence, this like couple of words are so important, because normally liability in law is comes up when someone directly does something, some harm. So if you kill someone, like you have to be held liable for that. But more and more, there is this idea developing that companies, states, banks, financial institutions also have the duty of due diligence. They cannot just simply say, I didn't kill like that person, like with with the knife that I sold, you know. If you sell them the knife and you know that it's going to be used to kill someone, you are implicated as well if you could have known that that was the intention. And with technology, again, it's so easy now to know that, especially these geographical location technologies. Like the car is so important as well, regularizing the land system in Brazil. Pará, which is one of most of the problems with illegal mining and deforestation take place. There is a joke that Pará, the state of Pará, has 3 floors of claims of people who claim they own the land, you know, 3 times like that. There will be a building with 3 floors like in the territory if everyone who claims they own the land, like were right in what they are claiming. But with technology, you can cancel those, not without a lot of difficulty if the political will is there.
Joanna, I have a question for you. It was not in the script, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on the role of litigation now with this changing political context.
Yeah, thank you. So I was already thinking about the role of litigation in this aspect of the finance, because back to what Otávio was saying, okay, so we're thinking about holding liable the companies for also the profits they make out of these illegal activities often. And this is where litigation is heading to. So the first wave of litigation was a more direct litigation brought against those who directly were causing deforestation. And we've seen thousands of cases brought by public prosecutors over the years. Then you have this second wave of litigation that is connected to climate arguments, which was filed against the government for inaction. And I think now we're heading to this third wave of litigation where you understand the complexity of these supply chains, you have the data, and you understand that there are companies and financial institutions benefiting from that. So in this type of litigation that is both climate and biodiversity deforestation connected in Brazil, we've seen this interesting case brought in France using the due diligence law, the loi de vigilance in France against Casino, the French supermarkets, but involving all the way to the violation of human rights and indigenous communities in the Amazon. And just a few weeks ago, a case again in France filed against BNP Paribas for the financing as well of deforestation activity. So I think that litigation has a really important role in not only because it's the way to make the risk material. So we're talking about how you need to make that material. How do you make that? Well, I think litigation is a really powerful way to make that risk material, and is a powerful way to tell a story. I think strategic litigation has that narrative power, and eventually, all going well, to make those who committed the crimes and the illegality liable for what they did. So yeah, it's a conversation I had with Jake there recently with Anahita, with many people here who are really thinking about how to make those connections. And yeah, I think it's an important part of this question. As I'm talking, can I bring some of the questions from online people?
Yeah.
So one of the questions is looking at this issue of the agribusiness in Brazil being highly mechanized. And so Luis Corman is asking, what is the view of the panelists on the downstream segment of supply chains like soy or beef, which include many of these multinational companies like Mercedes, Volkswagen, etc. How are these companies complying with EU free deforestation regulation? And connected, I think, to that, also looking at the equipment. I have a question from Sue Cunningham saying that the new government suggested they were pursue owners of garimpos who both finance the purchase of equipment and also are involved with the garimpeiros. So how do you think that the government will be in bringing these individuals before courts? So 2 questions, one on the...
I say the first one for Helen, and the second one to Otávio.
So I think on the downstream companies, and particularly he referenced some of the car companies, I think they're in for a bit of a shock in terms of the EU legislation. Very few,
The mic for him.
sorry, very few car companies have commitments around deforestation. And they obviously rely on the tanneries in Brazil in the supply chain. So I think that's going to be, you know, the leather industry obviously argues quite strongly that their leather is a byproduct of cattle and therefore isn't driving deforestation. I think what we've seen recently from papers and others is that's just not the case. It's a co-product without the money that slaughterhouses are able to make from leather and from other co-products. It doesn't make sense. So I think it's going to be a big challenge for those companies to comply with the EUDR because leather is in the regulation, although more derived products like car seats or shoes is not in the regulation. So I think there's a really interesting question of will we see more of that production sort of be outsourced into other countries and see more loopholes where maybe that production happens more in Brazil or it happens in other third parties like maybe Morocco or other places and then imported into the EU. So I think that's something to watch as well.
Thank you. There is some numbers already to show, like in the action of the government against illegal mining, especially in the Yanomami region, which was the first one they are focusing on, and they have already said that they are going to move to 4 different other areas after they finish what they are doing there. So according to government information, so we'll have to check as well whether it's accurate or not. 210 boats, airplanes, and engines have been already apprehended and destroyed in the Yanomami region. So I think on that front, a lot has been done already, and it's something that the enforcement agencies in Brazil have a large experience in doing. So we have this legislation that was very important in combating illegal mining and deforestation, which allows the agents to set fire to these machines because it's really hard to take an excavator out of the middle of the Amazon forest and take it to the nearest city and keep it there so they can destroy it, set fire to it. This is one of the laws that Bolsonaro was trying to change and actually managed to stop them doing that for the long 4 years of his government. So on that front, a lot is being done, and I think it will continue to be done. But as I said, that doesn't solve the problem because the economic incentive is so high that they will buy more machines, and Hyundai, Caterpillar, all these others are ready to sell them. And it's even good sometimes that it's destroyed, and they can buy a new one to replace it. In terms of individuals being brought to justice, to the criminal system, I think it's more complicated. And you can see by the numbers as well. According to government data, so this is their data, only 20 arrests have been made so far in the Yanomami region. And we know there were 20,000 illegal miners there by causing that harm. So I think that will be more complex. But as I said, I don't think repression, although it's part of the solution and it's important, is the most important bit. I think dismantling the incentives framework is much more important. So let's stop these companies from selling those machines in the first place, not to have to set fire to them and then create more environmental problems, because can you imagine 210 pieces of equipment being set fire and left in the middle of the forest? It's not a great solution either, is it?
Yeah, you're right. The last round of questions. Yes? Birgit?
Small question.
Sorry, just a minute. Yep, please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. Can I ask the panel's opinion on labels? The FSC label, for example, for forests, and we can buy wood from these forests that have been labeled with FSC, and now apparently it's known that FSC label's not that honest and has been given to forests that have been largely and vastly deforested. So we can't trust labels. So what's the consumer going to do?
Yeah. Sorry, there is someone over there. We need to ask.
So thank you so much for your talk. It's been a really nice discussion. And I wanted to ask you about punishment of environmental crimes. When it comes to traceability, we know it's hard to, well, it's not that hard to find where the products are being produced, although the companies make that harder for us. But when we do find some environmental crimes, when we do know that the deforestation was illegal or even legal that is irregular, as we say in Brazil, at the end of the day, are those people being punished? And how do we feel about that? And what do we know? What do we want for them to be? I don't know. I don't know if it makes sense to you. Thank you.
Anyone this side? Yeah, Grace?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
It was just really great from the one hand to hear that Brazil has a lot to teach in terms of, you know, Europe and the UK in terms of regulations and legislations. And the problem then in Brazil is about the implementation of those existing legislation, be it about traceability or human rights. And it's quite exciting at the same time to hear the changes happening. So the bit that it seems still, you know, not there is about the regulation here in the UK and the EU. And going back to one of your questions in terms of what can we do about it, there is very little engagement of the society in general with the regulation here. Often we talk about what's happening in Brazil as if we were not importing deforestation. So even universities, the money that comes to universities are going, like King's College and all the other universities across the UK, are going to fund deforestation as well. So we have a lot of power here in terms of putting pressure to governments and universities and banks. So just to highlight that, I think, before we don't take that home.
Sorry, there is someone over there. And money.
Thank you, everyone. Very interesting to be here and listening to the latest news. And my question is, in Brazil, we can have a progressive government and then things move forward, and then we have a conservative government and things go back. So how is like this accordion, like how we can make it less flexible? What can be done with the quality of the politicians, the Congress we have, the role of fake media these days? So I feel like there is a lot of enthusiasm. We have 4 years, and what happened next? So if Adriano or any of you could comment how we can be a little bit less wobbly and
over there.
It's a very quick question because you already have loads to respond, but I was just thinking, because we talk a lot, you talked a lot today about monitoring traceability and the capability of the Brazilian government to monitor what's going on the ground. But one thing that always worries me is that, for example, when we think about human rights, we are able to monitor what is happening with indigenous lands, with Quilombolas land, but there is a group of traditional communities that are really difficult to monitor because they haven't been mapped. I know that there are some civil society initiatives that are trying to map these communities, but I will be interested to know whether the Brazilian government is actually embracing this idea of mapping other groups that are not just indigenous and Quilombolas groups. Thank you.
Yeah, you can start with the response.
Yeah, well, I think that I will start just by bringing back what we were talking. I think that when the first plan against deforestation was implemented in Brazil, there was a very interesting tool, which was the embargoes, in which they froze the areas, and they had the solidarity responsibility of anyone that would buy what was being produced in the illegal areas. So I think that that could be used, for example, to complete this chain, so that also the ones that are industrializing products based on goods that comes from the first to the areas would also have to be responsibility. I don't know, sorry. When they sell it, yes, holding accountable when they sell that. So I think that this is one important thing. When we talk about labels, I do believe in labels if they have real social control, because the labeling systems are done to have social control. I think that we have two problems with many labels that are around. One part is that they are opening hands of the real social control. So there is this, for example, one important label that is used by the soy producers in Brazil, in which they created a system that the organizations that are the social control are the ones that are their friends, you know, that have worked to the company. So everybody's in the same agreement there, then it's hard to rely on. And the FSC, I think that they felt in this problem of using consultations of civil society as a very bureaucratic thing. So NGOs received letters saying that we are going to set this label for this company. Do you have something to say about that? Well, I work thousands of kilometers from the region where that company is working. So I'm not the constituency to be consulted about that. So labeling something that has to have real engagement from the civil society, and so that the social control works. But I think that it works. For example, we are working with a positive approach of this label called Origin Brazil, and in which products from the forest can be identified, and you can know where are the communities that it comes from, and there is a set of criteria that have to be fulfilled. So I think that it can work, you know. I think that when Bolsonaro closed the Amazon Fund, we had a very good example on what is an institutionalized policy that can survive to a government like that, because the fund was frozen and Bolsonaro could not use the money to anything else. And the money is still there for us to bring it back. So I think that what we have to do in terms of, we are not going to solve our problems and guarantee that we won't have another government like Bolsonaro soon. But we have to guarantee that the policies are institutionalized in a sense that they are not so vulnerable to this kind of political change, you know. So I think that we're beginning.
Anyone else would like to complement the questions?
I have so many questions.
Okay, now
from
let's go for the
online
questions
people.
of the audience. I just would like to make a comment about this. How are you calling it? Accordion. Sorry, I didn't remember the word. I think we have something that's quite new and unique in Brazil now, is a larger number of Black people, quilombolas, indigenous peoples in politics. And normally we pay attention to that just prior or during elections time, but they need also loads of support. And also women, yeah, we shouldn't forget the rise of women in politics in Brazil and some other countries. So they need support to be there, you know, during their mandate, because there is so much backlash on them. And I think this is a really important point.
Yeah. Just to mention what Marina has asked about human rights, I think that we have this difficulty when we talk about, for example, regulations that are set on the legality approach. Sometimes we have also difficulties to establish these limitations on what human rights are, to bring them inside a framework like that, you know. So I think that this is a problem, because in Brazil we have many legislations that are not completely established. And considering the other traditional communities, we have seen a very interesting invitation for different representatives of quilombolas communities and traditional communities to be in the government. And Marina has already announced that the creation of conservation areas, which are the way that part of these communities have their territorial rights recognized, is part of the strategy. So we hope that there will be more room and visibility for these groups. but it's still a huge challenge because it's a huge diversity and of small groups. So it's something that we'll have to find ways to deal with.
I will select a few questions. It's great. We received so many, and there are a few that are have similar types of questioning. So one is the importance of carbon credits. So whether you think that this could help fight deforestation, what's your view?
Question, right? Oh, no, sorry.
So that's one. And then there's another question here about how Brazilian civil society can be heard in the EU's impact reviews, which will decide whether to extend regulation to financial actors and whether it will cover the Cerrado. So if there's any way for actors to have a voice there. And the last one that I would, I think, bring is what would a strategy to change these economic incentives for deforestation would be? So what is the role for the law and lawyers in thinking of how to change the economic incentives? Easy ones. There you go. And then probably this is the last round of questions before we end on time. At 7:30.
Just to remember the second one.
So so the first one is
Carbon credit,
offsetting.
yes.
Second one on the how Brazilian civil society can be heard in the impact reviews. And the third one is if there's any role for law in changing economic incentives.
I can take the second one.
Yeah, I agree.
Quickly. So the tender has gone out last week from the EU for the impact assessments. We're expecting the impact assessment on owl or other wooded land is the unsexy way, which is basically the Cerrado extension to cover the Cerrado in mid-2024. That whoever leads that and wins that tender will need to consult with other groups, but that's where civil society in Europe, groups like Global Canopy have a critical voice in making sure we facilitate Brazilian civil society to have a voice in that consultation. So there is a process, but I think it's up to us in part, if the Commission are not going to do that, to make sure that that voice is heard. There's also a new Parliament in place and a new Commission in the EU in 2024. So I think the chances of having a legislative proposal are quite remote until we see what that Parliament looks like. Hopefully we don't get a lurch to the right in the European Parliament. But I think that's wait and see a little bit to see what that shapes out to look like.
Okay, well, you know, when I started to be an environmentalist, I was a very moderate person, and I'm getting more radical as time passes. So I really don't believe offsetting can help in any way. I've been waiting for this money for carbon credits for decades now, and they didn't arrive. And we are really worried about this idea that bioeconomy can solve everything, you know, and that bioeconomy is the new economy that we raise. I do believe that if we're talking about areas that are already deforested and open, we can think about very different ways of developing. But our main concern at this moment is that we have to recognize what is important to conserve, which are the forests. And we have to recognize how we keep forests, which is with the way of living of indigenous peoples and other traditional communities. And this goes much beyond carbon. There are a set of different environmental and ecosystem services that are engaged on that. And there is this whole economy of the social biodiversity that comes from the forest that we have to recognize. Because if at this point, we don't see this as the great challenge that we have, we won't be able to solve that. So in the beginning of the last year, we were really worried about these discussions of bioeconomy. And I even hadn't received the invitation I received this week from the Institute of Mining with for a seminar on bioeconomy and mining. So we were already worried that many people were talking about this without focusing on the difference between any kind of approach of bioeconomy and the necessity of having an economy based on forest products by the communities. And we were very happy that we had done a very strong work by joining a lot of organizations and social movements into an observatory for this economy. And we raised proposals and ideas in the debate of the campaign. And in the day Lula assumed, he made a speech in which he said that we have to follow the opportunities of bioeconomy and the economy of social biodiversity. And that was like music to our ears, you know, because they made the difference. Even the vice president, who is the Minister of Industry and Commerce, also said that. So I think that we have to focus on that. Where the money comes from, if it comes from an idea of carbon, if it comes from a scheme that we are able to develop in terms of other in ecosystem services, for me personally, doesn't make a lot of difference. What makes a difference is that that has to be connected with standing forests, you know, and what we have seen, especially in the discussion about bioeconomy, is a discussion of things that can be done in the lab, you know, that has no connection to what is in the ground. And so I believe less in offsetting and carbon credits and more in people, you know, conserving and restoring forests in the ground. I think that law can help with incentives, especially if we enforce the law and guarantee that the illegal ones doesn't get incentives, you know. And I'm sure that lawyers that study this also have other ideas that can be positive. In the case of Brazil, I think that if we don't cut the benefits that the illegal ones are getting, you know, the impunity, then it's hard to go anywhere else.
Otávio, you want to comment? Then you, Helen, sorry.
Before I answer, I'd like to remind you that there is wine in the room. Right? So
We are about to finish.
only 10 minutes more for us to access it. I wanted to make a comment on an earlier question because it came up again, this issue of labels and bioeconomy. I think there are some areas where there is no sustainable way of doing it. So gold is one of them, you know. There's a lot of talk, you know, a label for sustainable gold. But what is sustainable gold? You know, you have to clear the forest, pollute the river, like get the gold from, and for what purpose, right? Mostly for like something that, I know that gold is also used in some devices, and then perhaps there is a small need, but I think that it's very misleading to say sustainable gold or sustainable meat. I think the labels have also this problem as well as the credibility one that you mentioned. As regards the law, yes, as we have already mentioned several times here, I think that putting duties like this on up the chain, like not only repressing like the people on the ground there doing the dirty work, especially in illegal mining, I think this distinction is very clear that most of the illegal miners who are there like are not like rich people, you know, like they're actually sometimes in slavery conditions doing their work. So it's important to place liability upstream in the companies and in the financial institutions. And I think we are getting there. Joanna mentioned the developments in France and the cases against Casino Supermarket and the the bank, like Paribas, the bank. I think this is the way forward, and that we lawyers should be focusing on, and we are. There are lots of interesting initiatives on that front, like to put pressure for these incentive mechanisms to become illegal, and then you can go after these bigger people is more easily rather than go only after like the small people who are there on the ground.
Helen, I need to comment.
Yeah, just quickly, I think, you know, the EU regulation, think you have to recognize it's a coercive demand side measure. You know, there is a question of who pays, and I'm pretty sure the EU is hoping costs to not get passed on to consumers here. And I think that that's a question that is a hard truth. We just have to recognize that we have cheap food here in Europe. These commodities are very, very cheap. And a lot of this, the burden is put down up the supply chain on the production side. I think we should be asking, what are the resources that Europe is putting in to these producer government countries? The Amazon Fund $1 billion, that's a fraction of the value of these commodities that are traded globally. And I think that's some of the issues here is that European governments and others are not putting the money in where it's needed. I think also maybe for the wine and the discussion afterwards, but Lulu is in China this week with the biggest ever delegation of Brazilians now. China is the biggest consumer market for Brazilian beef, Brazilian soy, and I think that partnership and those discussions is also going to shape quite a lot of the future as well.
There was a question asking about the fact that 69 of the 250 delegates going to China with Lula are from the meat industry.
Yeah, exactly.
Part of them from GBS.
Sure.
Well, to make everyone eat picanha, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, on that note,
Joanna, would you like to,
Oh, yes.
to comment,
No,
say
happy to
anything?
wrap
No?
up.
Yeah.
I think wine is waiting.
yeah, so
Kate.
so I will only try to wrap up in 20 minutes so we can then move on to the wine. I'm joking. All it rests for me to do is to thank everyone involved, especially Grace, who actually made this happen. And it put me in touch with Frika and now Adriana, Helen, Joanna. So thank you so much for coming here. Thank you everyone who came and stayed with us. Your prize is the wine next door. And all the people who were joining us remotely as well. Sorry about the video thing, but you are going to receive the link so you can watch it at home. And thank you for Barbara as well for helping us run the show this evening. So let's move on to the next one. Thank you.